Well, I'd like to welcome Joe Smith from the great state of Ohio, which is where I am from, hail from, to the Resilient Biome podcast. Thanks for coming on, Joe.
I appreciate it, Rich. Thank you for having me, and really excited to talk about mold and the microbiome, and whatever else we can get into.
Isn't everybody excited to talk about mold? I mean,
I
it's
mean, as far as I can see, yes.
there we go. There we go. I'm just going to share a short bio with our listeners so get people have an idea of who you are, Joe, to start off. And then by the end, they'll even know you better. Joe is a certified health and wellness coach, a biome site practitioner, passionate citizen scientist, and self healer. He has spoken at both public and private health events as a guest speaker on health and wellness. He is also writing a book which details an incredibly deep dive in the importance of stimulating our natural digestive process to generate health and healing by exploring all the intricacies of the digestive process, start to finish. I want to get that book when you're finished. Joe has a health consulting business in Ohio called Evergreen Wellness, where he works by donation, and a Facebook group where he encourages his clients and everyone else to join in on the discussion. And lastly, he does his very best to provide the kind of service he wished existed when he was so incredibly ill: free, open to all, and actually helpful. Joe, I really appreciate that. Stood out to me, that last line, actually helpful. That's loaded, right? That implies
Yeah.
so often you are not helped.
Yeah, it's a pretty crazy implication. So yeah, I mean, so commonly we're not helped, and it goes far above and beyond. When we're talking in Western medicine, it's like a question of what do you consider as help? And if you consider symptom reduction help, then yeah, of course they can help you. But when it comes to some cases, some people have got some serious problems going on where Western medicine, which I didn't think this was the case until I personally experienced it myself, but they just kind of look at you with some side eye and think you've probably lost your mind. And they pretty much throw their hands up. And instead of them saying the actual words, we can't help you, they say, you need to be, I don't, in a psych ward or on some sort of psych meds. And that's the last thing you want to hear. So, for people who feel similar about their health and some of their experiences with otherwise the professional medical community, I'd just like to extend my hand and let you know that there is help out there. We've got science on a lot of things that medicine's not acting on. And they may have their various reasons, and some of them may not be the best of reasons, but that's to each their own, right? We don't have to sit back and wait for cures from them. I think they exist already. And, I think it just requires somebody who's determined to not only find them, but deploy some of the methods to bringing about that type of curative nature within yourself for you to find it. So I'm happy to extend my hand to help people to do that.
I love that. It's a great start to what we're going to talk about here. You, in the intro, talk about you were incredibly ill. So I wonder if you could first tell us when your health first began to fail.
Okay, sure. So, yeah, I know that that's a big question to bite off, but it's an important one to start off the conversation with. And so I really tried to make some bullet points here on my end to keep this generally pretty simple. And so, really, what it was a lifetime of basically bad health choices, which I'm not alone in. And it was that plus several events basically that led up to within a few months before basically what I would consider an acute phase, which is what I would say is probably a collapse of at least one or more of my body systems. It happened very rapidly. It was an acute onset, like you got food poisoning. And for some people,
Wow.
saying those two words is going to raise a red flag when it comes to chronic illness. So many people get chronic illness from food poisoning. Well, there's a reason for that, and we can talk about that a little bit more extensively later. But before we get into that, let me just explain. Excuse me, I got a couple of burps from my water here earlier, but um, part of the predisposition disease that I've had, like, again, as many of us have, it's my whole life. I kind of just thought we were supposed to beat up this body, just kind of abuse it, and that the body should be able to take it, and that it was supposed to be able to heal and recover with minimal or no setbacks. But in hindsight, I've realized that's pretty far from the truth. I frequently used to work really hard, oftentimes in nasty environments. I really never tended my wounds. I always overconsumed toxic foods with every meal. I had the full childhood vaccine schedule, which at the age of 35 was definitely still, I think it was like 60 or 70 different vaccines before the age of
Wow.
12. So who knows what kind of implications that some of the things that are in those could have on a small growing body. I don't know, but it seems to be that disease rates are seem to be closely linked with those who get excessively more vaccines than others. So there's always that aspect, which so many of us have in common, at least in my age group. But I also freely took pharmaceutical interventions anytime that my body got in the way of what I wanted to be doing. And so, I'd also always been like really active with extreme contact sports, often putting a lot of major stresses on my body as a baseball pitcher, a football kicker, and a fullback. I was also a big time weightlifter. Um, I was also a big time partier and never really slowed down for a minute. Certainly not to respectfully listen to my body, not ever once. And you know, I never stopped to think about the type of damage that I was doing to myself. I just thought this is the way life is lived. I don't know why I always thought that. It still seems to be a mental break that I can't get through today. Like I'm trying. I'm clearly I'm doing better, but occasionally you find yourself kicking back into that. I don't want to say primal, but it's your instinctual. It's what I was born with almost. It's how I was raised. I never knew of any other way to think about the human body and how my body works. And so, big part of healing is trying to learn and understand some of the perhaps traumatic response patterns that we have, even since the earliest times that we can remember, and trying to fix those. That's very hard. Uh, that's the predisposition part. Now, there were several events that kind of occurred 6 months prior to this onset of disease, which really has lasted for about 8 years now, which where one of which were like my encounter with Lyme and co-infections. Another was some stressful dieting that I was trying to do. I was actually trying to get myself a little bit better, but the diet that I was undergoing was a bit stressful, both well to my immune system essentially. And I had a big thing typed out where I was going to explain it all, the details and the science, but I don't want to get right off the rip boring people. But um, I had accidental poisoning from a water source that I was unaware of. For 6 months, I was drinking a certain well water source that I didn't realize was actually quite toxic and found and proven to be quite toxic. But for some reason, they just left it open available to the public. That's kind of weird. Um, and a lot of people believe that it was healthy. It was not. Let's see. I think I potentially had an accidental vitamin D overdose. Now, a lot of people they're going to say there's no such thing. Believe me, I know there is such a thing. You got to have some other nutrients with it. If you don't have them, you can put your body in a pretty rough place. Um, and I didn't have them. Remember, I was trying to diet really hard, and I was really trying to push my body to become better because I sensed that I was feeling not so well, and it was probably because I had contracted Lyme 6 months prior, but had yet to be completely chronically ill. I just noticed something was off. And right, so basically, there's all these events, and essentially, what they all did was play with my immune system, and they eventually all led to a decline in my immune system. But the major icing on the cake, I truly believe, was the mycotoxin exposure in the house that I was living in, which, as we'll talk about later, is extremely, extremely toxic, and it'll decimate the immune system. Um, so some of these events basically culminated in an acute and rapid onset of pretty serious and extreme disease on January 15th, 2018 at 1:30 p.m. Like it's like to the point.
Wow. Wow.
1:30, I mean, plus or minus 10 minutes, right? So this part of my story, albeit I've only just kind of summarized it briefly, it's just very detailed. There's self-reflection and some mental trauma. You know, these things have allowed me to kind of uncover this story. I didn't really fully remember all the details of even this short story that I've just presented to you because the body, when it gets that sick, it wants to forget and move past. And that includes the mental framework, your memories and emotions and all that. And you have to kind of undig that all up again. And so you can understand. And it took me a long time to figure out that it was probably Lyme disease the water source, the diet, the vitamin D, and the mold, all of which, on top of my already very unhealthy lifestyle, caused my whole system to just collapse and tank. And sent it into a cyclical, never-ending process of disease, which we'll talk about later. It's got a cool little diagnostic name now, but you know, this journey was like the deepest kind of self-discovery that someone would require to. Um, I'm trying to use words and not mince them. I want to use them correctly, but it's not a process of, oh, I'm awake now, but it's a process of growth that leads you to a place that's so profound and so it almost feels divine. Like, okay, this is definitely what I was here for. Like everything before this point of my life, I was a totally different person. Then I went through this giant transformative stage for the last 8 years. It's just been utter hell. And out the other side comes from the cocoon, a butterfly. And you know you're now changed and never going back to who you were. And I mean, it's just knowing something like that, having an experience like that, you know that it's part of your duty to share that now with people. And I've got quite the message to share. And really to kind of wrap up for my introductory here is that Mitt, Rich, I'm really glad you've given me a chance to come here on your platform and tell people a bit more about the thing that I've become so passionate about because I realized it was not just a key driver in my disease, but when I started looking around, I noticed it everywhere. And interestingly, I love to towards the end of this talk a bit more about how we're seeing the interactions and potential diagnostic criteria, we'll put it that way, for mold and mycotoxin illness, even in stool test results. So, yeah, really excited to talk about this.
Yeah, incredible journey there. And again, it's worth several podcasts, I'm sure, to get it all out. But I have never heard of somebody. You said you can note it down to within 10 minutes or so. Have you encountered others that had the same experience? And how, reflecting back, how do you explain that? It's just like your body was pushed over the cliff at that moment, essentially.
Yeah, so great questions. I think there are others who have experienced it in a similar way. Honest to God, and this is what I see when I look around, as I see a lot of people experiencing it one of two ways, right? The way I just experienced this acute onset, I think it's a little more rare, a little less common, but it does happen. And I think that happens when people's body, their capacity to detoxify the contaminants that they're putting into their body or in their immediate surroundings completely overburdens the ability for the body to process it. And so then all of a sudden you just get this overflow, right? And you become very violently and acutely ill. And it does occur, but I think that's a bit more rare than what I look around and see every day in people is that this kind of process happens slowly in people. And slowly but surely they walk the path of life, stepping on thorns and getting a sore foot and brushing up against some sharp bark on a tree and getting a cut on the arm. And slowly but surely the nature of the world itself is just withering us down. There's bacterial infections, there's fungal things, all sorts of little things playing roles, stealth infections, and you name it. There's all sorts of cool stuff that I think modern medicine, they know it's there, but I think because they lack largely, at least up to about the last 5 to 10 years, they've largely lacked the ability to test and find these things. They've just dismissed it and said, no, you have old people disease, or we just don't know what's wrong with you, and dismiss it that way. It's yeah, idiopathic or idiotpathic, if you want to call it that. So I see it in those two ways, and more so, it's definitely a slower onset, not an acute one.
Well, and of course, you're implying yours was also slow, but it came to a point, a tipping point, a very
Yeah,
serious one. Yeah,
yeah,
that's really crazy. Yeah. We rather than, of course, telling your entire story, we agreed to talk about it, as you already introduced the topic of mold toxicity, which you see as a rapidly growing health concern. So I'm going to start off with a question: how can mold be that dangerous when I make homemade kombucha? And this is cranberry lime, and it's delicious.
ooh.
So I'm drinking some mold. So what can be so bad?
That's great. So, firstly, so I'm not so sure that mold is a rapidly growing health concern, but I would definitely say that the mycotoxins that some molds can produce definitely is a growing health concern. But I think it's not necessarily a concern of just now becoming an issue, but instead I think mycotoxins and the molds that produce them are an issue that we're only just now recognizing which is like been around for a long time. In fact, you might find this interesting, and you might even know this, but in the Old Testament, mold's mentioned in the context of household contaminant and for contaminant of clothes. It discusses purification laws of that time and various health
In
concerns.
some
And
great detail. Yeah, that's
yeah,
a good.
yeah, absolutely. So, you already know this, but maybe your listeners don't, and maybe I'll just explain it for them that yes,
Sure.
you're right in quite detail. There's a pretty decent passage there where basically they explain what should be done about mold if it's found in a house. It explains the process of remediation, removing, replacing the contaminated parts, and if remediation fails, that basically the entire house needs to be torn apart, torn down, and discarded to a filthy place outside of town. Like,
Exactly.
no, we don't mess with that. So I would say it's not necessarily a new concern or a new problem, but certainly people are starting to pay more attention to the issue again. And I think that's a really good idea. Um, as far as the kombucha, uh, yeah, here we go. Yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting. So the fungus in kombucha is actually a bit different from the fungus that might make up a toxic indoor mold, because kombucha is supposed to be a yeast, and in fact, that's what. So when we talk about kombucha, it's made from what's called a SCOBY, or a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast. And so, while a yeast might be a fungus, a yeast is not a mold. And so, um, you know kombucha generally uses a beneficial yeast, and as you may be aware, if you get that SCOBY contaminated with the types of yeast that create alcohol, it could contaminate it or make it go bad or totally change the drink in general. Although there's always small amounts of it, right? But I think the beneficial yeast typically will outcompete any kind of harmful things. But I think the rule of thumb is if you brew it and there's colorful molds, you should probably throw it all away because it's probably contaminated even the SCOBY itself, and eventually the SCOBY dies too. In fact, I know this is the case because I used to make my own kombucha and sell it at a local health food store.
Nice.
No, I definitely don't exclaim to be any kind of professional or master at it. I certainly was not, and anybody who sold it there and tried it could tell you the same. I had a couple of good batches, a couple of not so great batches, but yeah, I mean, I was definitely into making it myself, and I've asked the same questions, and we'll talk a little bit more later why if you've got a mold or mycotoxin issue, toxicity issue, you still might want to avoid the kombucha because any little bit of it can really cause that cup to overflow again and create some serious problems for you. But anyway,
Yeah, interesting. And as far as the Old Testament goes, just so listeners know, that's approximately 1400 BC is when the events took place. So a long time ago, as you say.
oh yeah,
Yeah. It's not to get onto kombucha more, but I've never had a SCOBY go bad. But one time I sort of forgot about it. So it got more acidic and there were little tiny worms crawling
ooh,
all over my SCOBY. And I thought, what did I do? This is disgusting. And so I Googled it
yeah,
right away. Oh, this is normal. This is acid loving things that are often there and they don't come out until it
mm,
gets overly acidic. And I thought, I guess I'm
what are
drinking this
they?
all.
What?
I actually forget, Joe.
Oh
But
my
they're
gosh.
real, believe me, they're real. But
So
I
they're
I did the
they're
Old
like,
Testament thing and destroyed those.
oh my, so are they like parasites or are they just like,
They're harmless little worms.
it's
I'll,
interesting, like an
I'll
earthworm
send.
or
I have a
something.
video of
Okay.
it. I'll send it to you when we're off
Oh
air.
God.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah. I freaked everybody out. They were not going to drink kombucha, but you should. You should. All right.
Yeah.
It's safe. Another sip here.
Oh, great. Yeah, I gotta get
There
back
we
to making it
go.
again.
Yeah, I love it. So, you sort of implied that there are, as a lot of our listeners know, there are pathogenic bacteria and there are beneficial bacteria. Is that the same case with molds? Are they pathogenic and beneficial? I mean, you sort of implied uh, that at least the yeast in kombucha is beneficial or potentially.
Right. Yeah. So I think when it comes to mold, no, technically by standard definition, there's no pathogenic molds. Technically, to be a pathogen, it's got to be something that needs a human body or a host to survive for it to be considered a pathogen. So mold or yeast, they don't necessarily they survive in nature, usually pretty fairly well all by themselves, and generally, they're recognized as opportunists, where if somebody has presents an opportunity for mold or fungus to colonize or overgrow, that's exactly what it'll do. Um, it's so interesting that um, we've got these. I don't know. I mean, there's so many details that I could explain on this. I don't know. I'll let you ask your next question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I know. Both our minds are going a million miles an hour here. Um, in my own health journey, first of all, I learned so much just by doing this podcast and talking to great guests such as yourself. But I've focused almost exclusively on the microbiome and feel like I'm just starting to scratch the surface. I know almost nothing about the mycobiome. If you could just delineate those two, please.
Sure. So, um, the simple delineation is that one is involved with the microbes like bacteria, the microbiome, and the other is the myco, and that's involved with the fungal relationships in our various biomes in our body. So the microbiome in general, we're just talking about any microbial biomes within the human body. That could be the sinuses, the oral cavity, that could be the stomach, or the small or large bowel, right? But then when we talk about the gut microbiome versus the gut mycobiome, there's very little actually known about the gut mycobiome aside from what we know about the yeasts, right? And so we know that Candida is kind of an opportunist. We know that it likes to perhaps be a bit of a pathogen when it overgrows. Some people might even be more familiar with the fact that it actually changes its form, its function, some of its mechanisms for survival when it turns into a bit of a pathogen, when it's presented with these different types of environments to do so. And other yeasts like the Saccharomyces boulardii is a lot of people see that as like almost strictly beneficial, but yet still it's considered opportunist and is beneficial as it is. And part of the issue, and it's such a gray zone because I don't quite believe it in the way that it's classified in modern science and medicine, and that's such that they consider things as being opportunists if uh, in a normal, otherwise healthy person, like with a normal immune system, a microbe could become a pathogen for we don't know why, but it just does. What I see is when people have lowered immune systems, they have a lowered tolerance to these things, and that's what then gives them this opportunity then to grow. And so we kind of know this already with bacteria to be the case, but seemingly just the same. It is the same with fungi, specifically in the gut microbiome, but also it seems to be that way in the sinus cavity and anywhere else that we've found serious fungal overgrowth. That includes in the lungs, where you've got aspergillosis, which is caused by a toxigenic mold species, Aspergillus. That includes in the sinuses, where several different types of toxic molds are known to populate and reproduce, and unfortunately never really give us any benefit, it's only detriment. And you would think it makes sense to call it a pathogen, but really it's just a toxic mold at that point. I would always just usually, if you want to call it like a pathogenic mold, take the word pathogen and substitute it out for toxigenic, meaning it's a mold that's either known to or closely related to molds that are known to produce um, byproducts that are toxic to humans. And so, I mean, we can call those pathogens. That's fair and fine. Um, yeah, but so I don't know. There's so much. Again, I mean, I could talk your ear off for hours, and maybe I should, but to delineate between the micro and mycobiome for simplicity's sake is just one's bacterial and one's fungal. But um,
Yeah, that's very
I was just
helpful.
reading some of my notes here. I'm
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead, please. No.
Did you want me to kind of expand on um, how bacterial and fungal species within the gut may interact to generate health?
Let's get to that a little bit later. I think
Sure.
you're addressing that. That's really helpful. I think a lot of folks think mostly of the colon as bacteria, so I just want to lay that foundation.
Hmm.
There's myco species, the yeast and mold species, and of course viruses, the virome,
Hmm.
which I know less than nothing about. But one thing we also don't know is how they work symbiotically. There's so much to learn there, obviously. I think one of the goals of most practitioners in helping somebody is to, if you're talking about the microbiome bacteria, is to reduce the pathogenic bacteria or possibly pathogenic bacteria by increasing the beneficial or probiotic bacteria. And I've seen many people helped with this. They compete with one another in the right environment. The good guys win and decimate the bad guys. You certainly are very familiar with fecal microbiota transplants, where you can take care of C. diff in less than 24 hours. Yeah, now it can come back, of course, but it's amazing how that works. So does that sort of happen in the microbiome as well, or that there's a competition?
Yeah, there is some competition, and we're going to talk about this extensively here in just a moment. But there's a point I want to make about with your last question. I think you're really kind of asking about if there's a interactions with the well. Look, something we need to understand before we continue to move forward is there's really not a lot of information on how the fungal aspects or the microbiome interacts with the human host or with the bacteria in the microbiome. It's actually rather a bit of a new frontier. Now, aside from what a lot of people might think, there's a pretty decent little chunk of data on yeast, but when it comes to molds, basically the type of information we have right now revolves around uh, mass manufacturing of farm animals for meat and their feed and grain supply to make sure that they're not dying from hepatotoxicity or any of the other massive toxicities that can be imparted to them through mycotoxins, which are so common in dried feeds like corn and other grains. And so the majority of studies have really only just been on animals. And from that perspective, as far as molds and toxic molds go, that definitely means that we're not studying humans, and we've definitely not studied much at all about the interactions of these molds, either in the sinuses or in the gut, anywhere in the body, let alone their interactions with bacteria. So, just as you had mentioned with the virome, yeah, the very new frontier. You see, you don't know a whole lot about. I don't think anyone really does. And I think if anyone says they know everything about it, they're really fooling themselves. I even think that when it comes to the bacterial aspects of the microbiome, I feel like we only know maybe half of what there is to know about this as far as all the types of discoveries. I mean, different patterns that we see in people and what kind of disease processes that can leave them disposed to now and in the future. I mean, there's so much to know, and we've never really touched on the fungal aspects. I mean, it's so new to us. So I just
So
wanted to
is there
touch up and clarify
Yeah,
that.
yeah, no, thank you. So, is there any such thing as a mold or fungal probiotic that you could take a good fungus species and help it uh, lower the toxigenic species?
So, there's no true mold probiotic, but something like Saccharomyces boulardii being a yeast, also a fungus, right? Mold and yeast are both fungus. The Saccharomyces boulardii definitely can be combined with perhaps other yeasts. You don't really see that too often, but as far as like a true fungal probiotic, maybe you'd see something like that. You might consider the Saccharomyces as being a fungal probiotic. But uh, you know, to answer your other question initially, you asked if you what did you say? You asked about diversity of microbes being potentially the answer with fungus because it seems to be that that's the case. You crowding out bad microbes for bacteria, right? Okay, so
Correct. Yeah, I was thinking just bacteria. That's my only experience.
okay, and so you're asking if you think it's this if I think it's the same for fungus?
Correct.
Yeah, so again, this being I don't want to I don't want to keep calling it like, oh, cutting edge, but it's new. It's new. It's very new.
Yeah.
And we don't really have the data on that. But what we do know, we don't have the data, let's say, on human beings and in our gut microbiome. But what we do know is plenty enough about science in general, biology, and you look outside and check the rotting log in the woods, and what you come to see is that yeah, nature loves to harbor diversity. And if you ask building envelope people who are certified in looking for toxic molds, what you'll see them say very frequently is when you staunchly cut off the connection from an inner environment to the outer environment where all the diversity of spores and other bacteria and microbes are, what you end up finding is that there are certain molds that grow really well inside and they grow very fast without any competition. And so you would expect that if you have a similar environment like that in your house versus outdoors, that perhaps in your own body could serve in the same kind of way. If there's not a diversity of fungal microbes, that perhaps you'll have the same kind of problems. And so I would say to answer your question, theoretically, yes. Uh, you know, great diversity should help. But I'll also say that I've not seen anybody who has. See, that's a hard one to say because what I see is people who are sick with toxic mold and have mold growths in their sinuses and in their gut, and they're in large amounts. This is why they remain sick because these molds are in their body producing these toxins. And it's not super common, but it's something you should always look for. But I'm trying to make the argument that maybe you're not right, but maybe I'm not right, right? Because how sensitive is our testing? How do I know, Rich, if you don't have aspergillus, a toxigenic mold species in your gut right now, not producing toxins, you're creating symptoms within you? I don't know. We don't. Do we have good tests for that? The answer is we don't even have good testing. We don't have good science. So how would we really know? I would just say let's look at nature and see what happens there. The form and function in nature often mimics what's happening in our own little microbial forest.
Yeah, that's helpful. I do testing on myself and do interventions, and by most standards, I'm quite healthy, and my gut bacteria are quite healthy, but I continue to have occasional IBS symptoms. So it doesn't appear to be, the bacteria, because at least as far as we know, mine look pretty darn good. So who
Mm-hmm.
knows what else is going on? So that is very fair. One thing, so back to molds and yeast being part of the fungal. So is that at the kingdom level, and then mold and yeast are at the phylum level? Is that about how that works, or is it lower down the tree?
Um, Yeah, I couldn't tell you with certainty. I do
But
think
they
that it's
branch off at some point, is
yeah,
your point?
they do, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was just going right over my head. So I
It
appreciate
it
you
does for a lot of people,
clarifying
yeah.
that. Yeah, yeah.
And it did for me too. I was like, wait, I don't understand. Like I didn't understand why some of the times I would speak on things and people would look at me, scratch their head and say, "Do you not know what you're talking about?" It's like, apparently I'm not sure. So you got to go back and look. You're like, oh yeah, okay. So yeast and molds and okay, well these are mushrooms or funguses. Okay. So, but yeah,
Humility is the first step to growth.
yeah, yep.
Absolutely. So you talk about toxic mold being in the body, and we were talking about the microbiome, which I think of being in the colon, but can there be toxic mold pretty much anywhere in the human body?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe again, if we had the tools to really look, we would maybe know
Mm.
for sure. But our tools are actually pretty limited. But let's just say, based on what we know, um, it's not necessarily seen as common or normal, or maybe even healthy for these pathogenic or toxigenic molds to colonize the human body. Although in those with mycotoxin illness or even suspected mycotoxin illness, these toxic molds are commonly looked for with various types of testing. And yes, in various locations in the body that include the gut, the sinuses, the lungs, and even deeper into bodily tissues like even in otherwise seemingly healthy individuals that might not be affected by mold. But the people who are going to have these colonizations in these locations are usually more among the group that are immunocompromised. Um, and because these toxigenic molds can produce mycotoxins, looking for them in those with a mycotoxin illness. So looking for the molds that might be producing the mycotoxins is probably a pretty wise test early on. I know a lot of people opt out of it because they just don't want to spend the money. And oftentimes, if they are trying to treat and doing everything right, binding and moving and getting the toxins out, but yet they still have exposures and they've eliminated the fact that it could be coming from their own living environments, their home, their work, their car. And if there's any indications, like on an organic acids test, that there might be some fungal problems in the gut still or somewhere in the body, then you want to treat for it. Um, you know, commonly people would check themselves for growths in this way and then treat with antifungals. And usually after a few times, they start to feel a little bit better. It's interesting. So while some testing has been developed and made widely accessible to both medical practitioners and citizen scientists alike, like for the gut and the sinuses, there are other testing for things like lung colonization that's still mostly only accessible to medical professionals, requiring tests like sputum culture tests and chest x-rays to confirm if there's potential growths of what really medical science recognizes as one of the most common or only kinds of toxigenic mold growths in a body is aspergillosis of the lungs, which is totally not accurate. They just don't look or know to look for other aspects where it can colonize and create very similar damaging effects. So, there are some ways to get tissue testing done, though. So, for instance, someone could take a sample or a swab of their tissues, and they can kind of collect it at home or have it collected by a qualified medical professional, and then they can have that thing sent out to typically a private lab where they would have to pay out of pocket. Insurance doesn't usually pay for these sorts of things, and public doctors aren't usually allowed to do these sorts of things. So, but there are ways to have tissues tested. It's interesting because in my experience, I don't really see these sorts of tests being done um, too often, or at least as being a requirement to detect these mold species. Instead, for these systemic and pathogenic stealth yeast growth, something like an organic acids test might suffice. We don't have to take a direct culture of it from in the mouth, or you'd be surprised. There's even some evidence lately coming out that Doug Kaufman, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. He's not a
I'm not.
doctor, is he? But Doug Kaufman talks a lot about the fungal link. He talks about mycotoxins, but he's really been a big proponent of discussing candida basically as a pathogenic type of agent that really can cause some serious disease and is probably causing a lot more disease in people than anyone's willing to admit. I think he cites a couple of studies where there were lumps in a breast that were taken out. They were certain it was cancer, and they did the biopsy and ran some special tests after finding out it wasn't cancer. They said, well, what is it? And they found that it was candida or fungal growth in the breast tissue. So there's an example of potentially how big of a deal it could be to start looking for these types of fungal infections in the tissues. But there just really is, I mean, that's out there. I mean, people are just not doing that right now. But I think there could be some very interesting information coming from that. So I don't know if that's like fully answered your question yet or not, but there's a lot of ways that we can kind of detect for these molds, and there's quite a few places unsuspectingly that they can grow in the body and have been shown to grow.
Yeah, thank you. So, are toxins from molds essentially a metabolite? Something that it gives off, and then you said you can organic acids can sometimes be helpful. So it's changing the organic acids. The toxins are somehow directly, indirectly.
So the mycotoxin that comes from the mold, I assume, is probably a direct metabolite. I'm not sure what else it would
Makes
be,
sense,
but
I guess.
and then what as far as what the organic acid test is checking, they're not checking direct metabolites. They're checking indirect breakdown components of those metabolites. Well, yeah, they're not checking direct measurements of the toxin. They're checking the metabolites or the breakdown components. And, oftentimes they've right on the first page, the very first few markers, I think the first nine are fungal markers. And,
Mm.
oftentimes a few of those are going to be elevated, but there's others down further down the list that can also indicate higher oxalate content and some other things, which can also be linked to toxigenic mold species like oxalate, as we'll talk a bit more here towards the end of this. It's related to aspergillus. So there's a lot of other markers that you can, if you know what to look for, show up on the OAT.
Yeah, thank you. I've never had
Mm-hmm.
an organic acids test, so not as
Oh, okay.
familiar. So good to know that there's some help there. I read again because I know nothing about mold toxicity. I read a list of symptoms and I look at those symptoms and I thought that could be a whole heck of a lot of things. Pretty non-specific. So does there happen to be some more specific symptoms, other markers, which you as a practitioner helps paint a better picture? Because again, it's somewhat imprecise, but you're driving towards some level of precision.
Yeah. So, I mean, this really bites off a much deeper question. And so I'm going to do my best to answer it. I want to be thorough, but I don't want to take too long. So if you want me to wrap it up, just tell me wrap it up. But
Sure.
so, I had mentioned to you in a discussion before a couple of weeks ago at this point, that, there are some markers that are what would be considered, as the technical term would be, pathognomonic, or very distinct, as in belonging explicitly to mold and mycotoxin exposure. And perhaps I misspoke by saying it's definitely mold and mycotoxin exposure. So let me back up and explain how the thought process works, at least in my eyes, and maybe it's not correct. I don't know, but I think there's a lot of people that are starting to recognize this is the right way to look at this type of disease process. And so, what ends up happening when you and I've got notes here, but I don't have this part in here, so I'm gonna like just be spitting off the top. So basically, when somebody gets sick with mold and mycotoxin exposure, the body responds in a certain way, and the response the body can have is oftentimes going to lead to a chronic inflammatory response. And a lot of people already know the next word I'm going to say: syndrome, right? SIRS. And so SIRS is now a recognized medical diagnosis for people who have trigger agents which cause basically a cyclical cascade of inflammation within the body that doesn't stop. And as we all know, that inflammation, especially chronic and cyclical, never stopping, is going to create disease and a lot of problems and some breakdown. And the body's going to learn to adapt to it, and it changes and shifts and does all these biochemical things. It biohacks itself so that you at least have some semblance of normalcy in your life. So you're not literally feeling like you're dying all the time. That's what we do, right? This is called homeostasis. Homeostasis doesn't mean health, but the body tries to find some sort of balance. And we can measure some of the things the body does to find that balance. Now, this would be SIRS diagnostic markers. And so some of the things you might look for when a body has this type of inflammatory response, which, let me stop for a second. It's not just mycotoxins that can do it. There's all sorts of things that fall under this umbrella of what are called biotoxins. Okay, mycotoxins are one. Lyme, co-infections, those are another common one. Other less common things are things like the blue-green algae up in the Great Lakes. The toxins from those can create biotoxic effects. We're also talking about venoms from venomous snakes and poisons from spiders and other poisonous insects. We're talking about all sorts of things, and it's not just Lyme and co-infections. It's in fact all sorts of different bacteria that create toxins, can set the body in motion for a SIRS type of response. In fact, SIRS was first discovered when Dr. Richie Shoemaker found basically an infestation of Listeria bacteria secreting a toxin that was getting people mysteriously ill with neurological symptoms, and then their body could not recover. And when he figured out why and what was happening in the collection of similar biomarkers, he realized that they're similar not just with them, but with Lyme people, with mold people, with this umbrella of biotoxin illnesses. And so what ends up happening is your body gets anointed with this biotoxic poison, whatever it may be, it then goes into this cascading response of all these symptoms and measurable biomarkers, right? And so there's some tests that these guys have designed to look for not just mycotoxins directly in your urine, but also to check what your melanocyte stimulating hormone or MSH is, where your levels of C4A are to measure your immune function, how it might be responding, some of your inflammatory markers. They're very much the same across this umbrella. And so when we start to look at it from that picture, it's not necessarily just a mycotoxin symptomology that we're looking for. We're looking for symptoms that might point at mycotoxins, but are really generally painting a broader picture of somebody who is ill with a biotoxin. And when we look at those symptoms are pathognomonic. Not all. Here's the issue. Biotoxins are many are going to cause multi-systemic issues. So let me go in and discuss. We're not going to hit on the SIRS symptoms, but I'm going to try and point out the ones that are involved in SIRS, but are more relevant to mycotoxin exposure. Does all this make sense so far?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. All right. So,
And by sure, I don't mean sure in quotes,
yeah.
but I'm following.
All
I'm
right.
learning
All
as I
right.
follow.
Great. So symptoms commonly associated with the biotoxin illness in general. These are going to be things classically, as you would see, like brain fog. But this isn't just like, oh, I've got brain fog. No, this is like some extreme brain fog. You know the difference if you see it in somebody or it's happening to you. Key differences are things like you are always forgetting where your keys and phone are. Things that pretty extreme. Ready? Sometimes you forget who your name is or where you are. If you're
Wow.
driving, if you're laying in
Wow.
bed, you forget. You just totally no idea. It's just like a blank slate. You frequently are found wandering around or appearing to be seemingly lost, whether it's through your house or you're driving around and forget where you're going or don't know how to get where you're going. Very slow process, mental processing. So, um, it's like having trouble finding words all the time, not knowing, like I couldn't get up here and speak to you like this just a couple of years ago. I would never have been able to remember half the things that I needed to say. Um,
So it
Largely,
looks like
I've
dementia is what
recovered.
you're describing, really.
That's right. So it's a part of
Yeah.
that.
Wow.
Another one is mitochondrial dysfunction, but that's kind of like, oh, it's a buzzword of today. Like, give me some examples. How about unrefreshed sleep? Like consistent, chronic, very unrefreshed sleep. Like you fell asleep, got 10 hours, woke up, and you're ready for another nap after an hour. Like you're exhausted. You don't feel like you are refreshed at all. You woke up with pain and extreme fatigue. Profound fatigue is the diagnostic criteria. Um, One of the biggest tip-offs for mitochondrial dysfunction is mitochondrial dysfunction is something that I actually dealt with a lot these last 8 years. It was horrible, and a lot of people that I know of who have dealt with it, they know it's really bad. It's called exercise intolerance, and it doesn't quite sound as nice as it may seem. Really what it is it's not just an inability for you to exercise or anything like that. It's really got a lot to do with partially that, but a lot to do with your recovery. So after you get done exerting yourself, your cells need to rebound, right? They need to create ATP and have all these different biochemical processes happening. They're pulling nutrients in and dumping junk out, and they're trying to have cellular respiration and function, and they can't. And what it feels like is you are like I don't know. I try to explain to people it feels like my body is just reeling. Every cell is just like starved. I cannot recover. The very feeling you get when you're sprinting and you're like your heart's beating out of your chest, you're just done. You can't keep going. You're exhausted. And then you stop. That feeling for a long time for me would stay with me hours after, days after. I mean, my body could not recover. That's exercise intolerance. That's very uncommon to experience it that profoundly. Another one is temperature dysregulation, which could be seen as something that's common for people with like hyper or hypothyroid. So you say, well, there's some overlap there, but really what we're talking about is not just that, but it's somebody who can't tolerate hot or cold environments, and specifically in ways that are so extreme that if you're put into an environment like a sauna, the body refuses to sweat. Like you can't sweat. It doesn't know how to cool off. that doesn't work. And there's a reason for this, is that one of the markers that becomes elevated is it's antidiuretic hormone. And basically the body's like saying, hey, this hormone's so elevated in such a way that I don't feel the need to urinate. I don't want to sweat. I need to hold on to my water. And I theorize naturally, the body says, my cells are like raisins right now. I'm dead. Like I need all the moisture I can keep. And so it refuses to let it go. And as you'll see, another one of the symptoms is a strangely elevated level of thirst all the time, or strangely losing the urge to urinate. And especially if both drinking a lot of water and not feeling like you need to go to the bathroom at all. Even if the bladder is completely full, you can feel it, you're bursting, but you still can't go to the bathroom because you don't feel any urge. That's a big sign as well. And also, you got this dysautonomia, or basically where the autonomic nervous system is, it seems to be not working the way that it should. And a lot of people might we talk about this a lot in these communities. You hear a lot of people talking about vagal nerve dysfunction. This is dysautonomia. And so this is something like where you're frequently feeling dizzy or almost fainting, like out of nowhere. It doesn't make any sense. Why would you feel like your body just got plunged over the top of a roller coaster that goes straight down? No rhyme or reason, but you feel that. This is a dysautonomia type of thing. And it's pretty extreme to that degree. You'd also see things like having high or low blood pressure consistently, like all the time. Especially uh, if your blood pressure actually seems to change, like you would expect it to be high, but it's now low. Things like that. That's dysautonomia. Also, constantly low heartbeat. That's something I had. My heartbeat was always like 42 beats per minute, which is any lower than that, and I mean, I should be in the ER. Like it's very low.
Yeah, pacemaker or
Even when
something. Yeah.
exercising. What's that?
I'm sorry. At that point, you might need a pacemaker if it stays down that low.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a big part of this dysautonomia, when it comes to low heartbeat rate, it could even happen when you can even have high heart rate, but it doesn't change much even when exercising. Like that's the big key, is that, oh, the nervous system is not responding like it should. That's dysautonomia. And so these things, when you're having somebody who's got all of these together, you should really be thinking about a biotoxin illness. This can be Lyme, mold, all these other things. Now, mold specific things now, as we really wanted to hone in on, is ice pick pains, right? So we're talking about ice pick headaches or migraines, ice pick sinus pains, or even these random ice pick pains like you might feel in the body where it almost feels like a nerve was struck. But it's actually the dead giveaway is when you feel these pains in areas of the body where there's no known major nerves. You say, well, there's nerves running through the whole body. Yeah, but they're deep buried within the spinal column and underneath the chest. These things you usually feel within the first inch or so of the body. Sometimes you feel them really deep, but for me, I'd feel them really like shallow, top part of my skin. And it was a strange feeling for me. And I never knew what they were. I had them my whole life on and off. So I probably had I traced my story back a bit. I've seen the symptoms now in family members and places where I've lived throughout my life, and I've begun to recognize, like, oh, maybe I've been kind of predisposed to this for a long time. So that's one that's more specific to mold. Um, uh, to me, I always felt like I would have like and I'm going to be a little graphical, but this just like imagine feeling this. And I used to get these all the time. I actually haven't had one for 2 years. It's been really nice. But it felt like someone buried a molten, like a molten red sharp pick into my back that had like a hook on it, which like grabbed onto a nerve and just like ripped it in half, like immediate, just in and out, like the worst feeling. And I would verbally say, ah, like, and people just look at me like, what's wrong with you? Like, I don't know. But nobody's ever heard of that. You go to the doctor and tell them, I don't know. They don't know what that is. They might tell you it's, oh, you just have a nervous system problem. Son, you probably have anxiety. Like, I don't know. Maybe if that's my only symptom, but if I've got that and all these others, there's more. Electric zaps, so tingling, numbness, burning sensations. Again, especially if these phenomena are experienced in areas where there's no known nerves to generate such feelings. Hypersensitivity to smells, but not just like those seen in mast cell activation syndrome, um, or chemical sensitivity syndromes, but we're talking like hypersensitive to all sorts of smells, not just molds, but everything. I mean, somebody's got a pizza across the I don't know, across the church, and you could smell it, like very sensitive smell, like a dog. Um, Strange sensitivities, which are now recognized and frequently being attributable to mast cell activation syndrome or MCAS, like extreme and constant light sensitivity, sound sensitivity, sensitive to touch, extremely sensitive to almost, if not all foods, other smells, and other sensations. People who have that very frequently have biotoxin illnesses, and this is a very common one with mold. And you also have mental manifestations that are to an extreme, like extreme anxiety out of nowhere, almost this feeling like you could just like jump out of your skin if you had the chance, like, and you wouldn't be able to do it fast enough, like, boy, just get me out of here. That feeling, it's like an unfounded kind of panic attack, something like you've never experienced before. Even if you've had panic attacks before, the ones that you experience with mold and mycotoxins, as the criteria state, it's profound. It's beyond that. um it's depersonalization, mental things like that, where a lot of people hear that word and kind of don't really know what that means, but it's almost like we put it together. What's depersonalization means? Like you're no longer yourself. What does that mean? Like, well, for a lot of people, they're looking down. When somebody's having a conversation with, they're not in their body having that conversation. They're like away from it. They don't feel a part of this reality. They're like watching it. They're super uncomfortable. And this is basically the description that a lot of people give to their psychiatrists or whomever is prescribing them anti-anxiety medications. They say, well, I've got a fear of being in public with meeting new people. This is the feeling they get. So I don't know. Is this potentially hinting at mold and mycotoxins? And we're talking about these extreme panic attacks. We're talking about so many people becoming very sensitive to things. What else are they experiencing? So some of these symptoms, while they may seem kind of broad stroking and perhaps non-fitting or descript or distinct, the ones I just listed off are the ones that are really commonly found among those who are sick with biotoxin illness and mycotoxin illness. And just for one last point, mycotoxins, because they're both fat and water soluble, one side and the other side of the little particle, the molecule, they're both fat and water soluble. That allows them to rapidly penetrate through membranes in the body. So if you get a mycotoxin particle that lands on the skin, it's been shown that within 15 minutes it can be in your brain, and within it's about 1 hour they found that you can be excreting it in your urine. And so they move rapidly through the body. And part of that, part of what this means is that you can experience symptoms virtually of any kind. That includes your brain, that includes everything: liver, kidneys, you name it, in your eyes, in your big toe. If you've got multi-system symptoms, so symptoms in multiple systems of the body, so endocrine, digestive, mental, there's many, on your skin. If you have symptoms in multiple systems, and the rule of thumb is 3 or more, the likelihood of Lyme is very high. So that's another criteria. So excuse me. So we've just kind of reviewed like a lot of symptoms, but in the grand scheme of the total body symptoms, that there still exists this vast amount of symptom overlap with other diseases, which, in fact, I would say we've only really covered about 5% just now of the kinds of symptoms that most people have mold and mycotoxins experience. So another dead giveaway is somebody who's got so many symptoms that they don't know where to start. They literally have no clue. And these are usually the people who are of the sickest, that are absolutely direly dealing with mold and mycotoxin illness at its finest. And I don't want to say nothing else, but it's like the biggest thing on their list they got to look at and fix. Now, you can still have, only a few of these symptoms, and they can even be minor. And you can still pee in a cup and have very high levels of mycotoxins, which, if were removed from the body, could absolve some of the symptoms or all of them. So the range of symptomology and presentation is pretty vast and diverse. But something as a practitioner, and I'm not going to sit here and speak like I'm a doctor, just so you listen, I'm not a doctor. I'm just self-taught. I'm a self-healer, and I'm happy to help anyone who wants help with these sorts of things. But something that a practitioner, which maybe I could call myself legally, I don't really practice anything, but a lot of people are calling themselves practitioners nowadays. They don't practice anything. But as somebody who does practice, not me, but if somebody does, one of the first things that they should be doing is asking clients about taking a symptom list. And especially if they suspect mold, I mean, I try to work with people who have what I suspect is a potential for mold issues, just because that's kind of my wheelhouse. I'm really good with kind of, I'm like a mold whisperer, like, one of the big things you want to do is check these, and don't just overlook. You really got to dig in. Sometimes people don't realize that little bit of acid reflux they have in the morning, or the little bit of impatience they get at night while they're trying to fall asleep sometimes, or some of these different feelings they might have, they might be otherwise pretty minor, but could grow into something very serious, like some of the symptoms we've explained here, some of the mental manifestations. Some of these are still keys, indicators, and people should still be checked. It's otherwise pretty simple of a test for a toxin that is very prevalent, as we'll talk about soon.
Well, I have to say, the list of symptoms you're talking about here are not what I read online. So very,
Exactly.
very severe. And you've helped me, Joe, move from information to anxiety. I'm being melodramatic because you mentioned dysautonomia quite a bit. And 2.5 years ago, I was diagnosed with COVID-induced dysautonomia, and thankfully, symptoms that one summer were happening every few days, but I would have them for maybe 3 hours and then start to feel well again. But just some not terribly severe, but really odd things in a wide variety of them. Like, for example, I'll work out and do a weight workout, and my resting heart rate, at night is mid 50s, pretty decent.
Yeah.
But I'll be working out pretty hard, and on a good workout, it might be, and this is not an aerobic, this is, weights. So 115, 120, maximum heart rate. But I can be doing the same exercises, and some days my heart rate doesn't exceed 80. And I'm like, this is not right. And I don't even necessarily feel any different, but it's weird. So,
Yeah.
but thankfully, in the scheme of things, I know people are just decimated by dysautonomia or long COVID, various things. So
Right.
that
You know,
that's really interesting.
it's so interesting you mentioned that, because it seems that some of the leading treatment strategies for things like long COVID, or even those who experience vaccine injury from the COVID vaccine, some of the treatment strategies actually for SIRS and biotoxin illness work really well. In fact, it seems that perhaps some pharmaceutical interventions like the COVID vaccine, or even in the case of long COVID, could it be inducing the same kind of body system response that other biotoxins induce? And so it would make sense that you might fit into a bit of the symptom picture there. Um,
I did
so
not have vaccine, but that was my when they started coming on the second time I had COVID. So
mhm,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it's crazy. Well, we talked a lot about symptoms and diagnostic criteria. We should get into leave some time here for prevention. How do you prevent mold toxicity, and any remedies for this?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, the best prevention is avoidance. Like all toxin exposures, and we're going to kind of broaden the picture here. We're not just talking about mold and mycotoxins. Let's talk about, you were exposed to a toxin at work, right? Like all toxic exposures, the first step is always to remove the subject from the toxic exposure, right? So, for something like a work-related toxic exposure, you know, this is typically the easy part. But for mold, it's a bit of a harder part, arguably, because sometimes, finding and avoiding the mold is almost impossible for some people, or at least seemingly so. And not everybody's got the ability to just move or renovate, and finances, and mold kicks your butt. It sometimes it puts you out of commission. There makes you bedridden. It did me for about a year. I was luckily was working from home, so I was able to keep working. But if I had to go in and to a job, I don't think I could have possibly done it. And so there's a lot of people who are in positions like that that can't do it. They're not paid as well as I was, and I wasn't paid well at all. But I couldn't imagine working fast food or something like that, and then having these types of illnesses plaguing me, while then having all the stress and having family, and on and on and on. There's excessive reasons why sometimes leaving the environment that you're being exposed to is not very easy. But this is step one, and it's an otherwise a simple step in explanation. Step two, another simple step in explanation, but definitely more complex to understand, is getting the exposure out of the subject, right? So we're talking now about detoxing the mold, actively detoxifying the body. And a lot of people kind of get hung up. They hear that word and really bite hook, line, and sinker into a lot of the stuff that we've been, I would say, has been popularized in kind of the pop culture for detox. And what does that look like? Is that are we juicing celery this weekend, or are we taking these capsules for of herbs for, I don't know, whatever is claimed on the back of the box? That's not quite the kind of detox we're looking for. We're really looking for a full body systemic approach, head to toe, to try and push these toxins out of the body. And one of my favorite things to do is to help coach my clients into this thought process of, you really need to stimulate the digestive process, start to finish, A to B, mouth to anus, because every part of that process is involved in not just absorbing the nutrients that your body direly needs, because you've got all these toxins. With this toxin overburden, you now have a high demand of nutrients required for detoxing it. So not only do you need to make sure that you're able to absorb the nutrients, but you want to make sure that you're encouraging good bile flow, because that's where the toxins are bound to. They're bound to the bile, and they come out in the bile. You also want to encourage good microbiome, a good healthy microbiome, because as you probably know, Rich, there's certain microbes in the gut that will break down and unbind your bile with an enzyme that they produce called beta glucuronidase. And when you do that, what ends up happening is all the toxins, they just get released back into the blood, retoxifying the body, putting another stress on the liver, and it's an endless death spiral. Repeat, and it sucks. It's not a good time. And so you want to make sure you put a good focus on your gut microbiome too, to make sure that you're getting these toxins out. And you want to make sure you're providing the body with the substrate, all the substrate it needs. So you're talking about taking taurine, you're talking about betaine hydrochloride to acidify the stomach. We're talking about making sure you chew your food. And you want to definitely make sure that you're going to sit down, say a prayer and a thank you, relax the body, and then eat. You want to be in a relaxed state. You want to make sure that the nervous system is set on to digest the food. You want to make sure that you've got good pancreatic enzymes being either secreted or provided by capsule when you eat the food, so you can break it all down and help with absorption. You want to make sure you're supplementing any deficiencies you have. You might want to make sure you're taking some certain kind of herbal protocols to keep the small bowel clear, because honest to God, a lot of people who are sick with mold, it blocks up the bile. The bile naturally is what keeps the small bowel clean and clear. Creates chronic inflammation, which slows the production of enzymes. Enzymes also help to keep the small bowel clean and clear. That's why SIBO is such a common thing with toxic exposures, is the body gets backed up. A toxic exposure to you, Rich, of I don't care, name a toxin. You take that same toxin. If you're not sick, but I am, from the same toxin, your body's handling it just fine. Your liver's working just fine. It's got rid of it. Mine is not. And now I'm going to have problems. It doesn't matter. It depends on how the body's responding. What I try to coach people is, you want to make sure that whole digestive process is working through start to finish. And once you start doing that correctly, then you can add the binders, because the binders, without a doubt, will constipate you, and do so very, very seriously. And beyond that, we can do enemas to help pull the crap out, literally, toxins and all. But there's certain things that we can do here to really modulate the function of the body, but we want to make sure that we're enforcing it to work properly again. Also, oftentimes in those who have the mycotoxin exposures, their immune system is quite utterly suppressed, and unfortunately, that leads to, there was a study which I don't recall it at this point, but basically it concurred that it seems about somewhere between 70 and 90% of the entire planet have H. pylori living in the stomach, albeit you can't really find it because our detection is not so good unless we're using qPCR. It seems to be a bit better, but that's a rather new thing that's really only been included in the GI map as of lately. Not lately, but for the last like 5-10 years, how long they've offered it. But in the grand scheme of things, this is generally a new type of testing procedure. But it was theorized that it was about 70 to 90% of all people have H. pylori. And if you've got an immune suppression, that means you're immunocompromised, and that puts you at risk for all sorts of problems, not just including fungal colonization and overgrowth of toxigenic mold species. We're not just talking about bad bacteria like C. diff. We're talking about H. pylori. We're talking about small bowel overgrowth. We're talking about everything. We're talking about malassezia that creates dandruff in the hair. That's a fungus, a yeast. And we're talking about all sorts of things. So when you have a lower and suppressed immune system, you also expect a lot of the things that your secretory IgA moderates to go a little out of control as well. And so it's another thing you look for in testing. But when it comes to detoxifying, another part of that is to balance the immune system. Because when the immune system's balanced, it can do its job. It can tag a lot of these particles as antigens, escort them to the liver, get them out. But if the immune system's suppressed, it doesn't do that. So now these things just float around on top of the fact they're known as being sticky because they're water and fat soluble. They don't come out very easily, unfortunately. I could go into a bit of an explanation on this, but basically our body has certain mechanisms for grabbing, latching onto, and pulling, like directly binding water soluble nutrients, and mechanisms for fat soluble nutrients. But we don't have anything for things, not nutrients, but particles. But we don't have anything that works on things that have both water and fat soluble. It kind of jumbles up the whole system that we have, and it doesn't work well. So things get stuck. So if we're not actively making our immune system balanced and active, we're not going to get a good detoxification process either. So the whole thing, it's a whole body process, but I really focus on digestion, start to finish. And I think that serves the biggest benefit to people.
So it's not quite so simple. If I'm very constipated, just eat more Metamucil. That's not going to cut, is what you're saying.
Yeah, not quite. For some, it does. Not for everybody.
Of course. Yeah. I'm sure the challenge is, somebody listen to this and say, well, I'm constipated. Maybe I've got mold toxins, but you're certainly not saying that, but there's so many symptoms that overlap with other things. But when you're like really, really sick, as you described before, you should take note of that. Yeah. Well, like so many people who end up discovering really important ideas and helping others, it starts with their own health journey. So common. This is the case with you. And, mentioned, you're a practitioner biome and the Evergreen. No, am I saying that right?
Yep. Evergreen
Wellness. And I know you say you do it either for free or for donation, whatever anyone can offer, because this is not your main job. You're just trying to help people. You're trying to have enough just to continue to help people, right?
Sure.
Is the idea. So was that, how was that process of your own health journey moving to help others?
Basically after I totally gave up on modern medicine, and basically because they quite literally rejected me in many of the office visits, and in the others they told me that they just gaslit me, said that what I was dealing with was mental or emotional, and I need to get over it, or I just need to go live my life, and you couldn't possibly be having all these symptoms and things like that. When it's that feeling of rejection that made me say, it's like, I need to become the healer that I need. And when I realized that I could actually do that and that it was working, and at this point I'm safe to say it worked. I mean, I feel absolutely masterful of at least over my own domain. And I know that humans share pretty similar physiology. So, I thought I realized something kind of profound. It's like, uh, you know, when I was sick, the only thing I ever really wanted was help. And, I cried desperately to countless medical professionals. I was pleading to them. I said, can you help me? And I would explain the situation. I'd give them all the data, the science, the papers. I'd cite the medical journals, and I would show them doctors that are treating it. And I would say, look, this doctor says that he'll work with you to treat me. And, no doctor wanted to have anything to do with any of the stuff that I was bringing. They just wanted to tell me I was crazy. And, you know, um, because of that, it was when I was really pushed to find ways to order my own labs, learn how to interpret them, to generate protocols that worked well for me, and understand why they work well for me, so that I know that maybe the protocols that work well for me won't work well for you, but I could help you to design something, right? And I kind of realized this, and I was like, wow, I really should help people, because I've helped myself, and I actually understand what I'm doing at this point. And if I don't, of course, tell people I'm not sure. I couldn't tell you how frequently I tell that to clients. I'm not sure. There's so many people have so many different diseases and different genetics and different patterns, and there's all sorts of variables here. Like, I don't know everything. Nobody does. But that's the beauty of being a self healer, is that you're not limited by what somebody tells you you can or can't practice. You can just go learn and put it into place. And so I realized that in doing that with myself and having success, that I can show others that they can do the same. And so I wanted to do that for exactly what I wanted. Was I wanted somebody who would listen to me. And clearly, I don't mind being charged $100 an hour, but that's not the rate people were charging. I couldn't afford even 500, 1,000, 10,000. You should see some of the prices that some of these big wig doctors who treat biotoxin illness and SIRS, but what they charge, it's like 20, 30, $60,000. It's insane. And I was like, it's pure robbery, and people don't deserve to be bankrupt. They deserve their health back, and they deserve not to be gaslit and told there's no answer, there's no way. They're basically, you're telling people to give up on life. It's just not true. I mean, we have the science, we've got the data, and what we don't have, we will soon have. The thing is that 90%, I would say maybe 95% of the stuff that I cited and I used for my own recovery are definitely not things that modern medicine are using. Modern medicine practices I've found are totally useless, but it's the testing. Testing is brilliant. It's always been brilliant. Get tested. It's great. But some of the mechanisms by which they might go then to do what you would expect is make your body healthy again. I don't think they do that. You might need to then take that upon yourself. I'll leave it to listeners to be the judge, of course. But I've come to realize, at least in my personal experience, I could utilize their testing and then interpret the data and create the results that I need through the way that I can do. And by doing that, I was like, oh, I'm better. I should help people to do the same. So that's kind of where I've come from. The suffering is really what propelled it. And yeah, I just feel like it's a bit of a calling. And as you said, I kind of do it as a hobby now, right? It's kind of a hobby. It's kind of not. Look, I'd like to open a brick and mortar store. I want to do supplements and yoga and things like that, and different therapies. And this is kind of like a phase one of that. I would just check it out. Do I like this? Yeah, I love it. I love helping people. Nothing fills your heart more when somebody says thank you for something like this. And as irritating as it may start to become, like, I'm only human, right? You get a lot of people want help. They need it. And I know they need it, but I'm only one man. And there's a lot of people who come to you and they want a lot of help. And, I do my best to give that help to people. But sometimes um, it's nerve wracking, right? Because you almost feel like you have to carry this weight. So I have to continually remind people, and I'll say it again right here as this final closing statement to your question, is that I'm not your healer. You're the healer, but I will absolutely help you walk that path. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, I love it. Tremendous story. I wish you the absolute best, that your business, quote unquote, continues to grow so you can keep helping people. I love that. As you're talking, you brought in an Old Testament example. I'll bring in one from the Gospels that reminds me of those that spend all their money on these medical doctors, etc. There's a story of a woman who has I think it just says a flow of blood for 12 years. She spent all of her money. I mean, it literally says this in the Gospels. Spent all of her money to doctors, and they didn't help at all.
Hmm.
That's like crazy. It reminds me just what you're describing. Of course, Jesus swoops in and completely heals her. That's the point of the story, but the buildup definitely sounds like what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. You'd think we would learn from these patterns through time, but we don't. We just seem to repeat them. And maybe one day we'll learn. I guess I'm trying to help us to learn. We don't have to repeat these patterns. I think we need to put our faith in other things other than put in ourselves and in God. Not in others.
Joe, what specific microbiome bacterial overgrowths might suggest potential toxic mold exposure? And are there any additional characteristics or test result markers that can help strengthen the suspicion of possible mold toxin? And based upon your experience, how often do you see these markers flagged in your clients?
Yeah, Rich. So interestingly, I actually began to notice a pattern while reviewing people's stool tests on a Facebook group, and I also it happened to be around the time where I started learning about oxalates. Specifically, I started noticing a pattern while reviewing people's GI map tests, and I realized oxalates can be produced by a toxigenic mold species called Aspergillus, and which is again a toxic or toxigenic mold frequently implicated in serious human disease. So, I know the body loves to adapt to its inner and outer environment. And so, I began to notice that perhaps one of the inner adaptations that happens is I also start to notice that Pseudomonas aeruginosa is frequently found to be elevated when Aspergillus is found, or at least when the person consumes a very high oxalate diet. Now, generally, what I do is I review through these tests, and I don't just say this out loud. Like I check all the markers and then write up a big old summary before I say anything at all, because sometimes markers don't mean the same thing alone as they do with the fuller, broader picture. So what I end up doing is because the GI map doesn't really measure, it doesn't measure. I wouldn't say it measures oxalates or aspergillus at all, but it does take a measurement of the Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And so what I notice is when that's high, I start to look for other markers. Okay. And I see them pretty frequently. It's surprisingly frequent. What I end up seeing is I also see like low levels of secretory IgA. I might also see levels of H. pylori, but not necessarily at infectious rates. Yet in the description of their post, they might mention things like, some of the symptoms that are associated with H. pylori, which we commonly hear in this group. It's a digestive group, like they've got acid reflux or heartburn and things like that. Well, you've got H. pylori that's showing up here. You clearly have at least a tampered mucosal immunity. That barriers at least tampered because your secretory immunoglobulin A, your SIGA, is low. So that means that potentially the immune system in the stomach, secretory function in the stomach isn't working very strongly. So perhaps you're experiencing symptoms even though the bacteria is not overgrown. So perhaps you have some immune suppression or compromisation. And so what I know from my specialty of looking at things from my lens, I think, well, what are the things that can cause that? Well, one of the primary things I think is probably most common is the mycotoxins from mold. And so the elevation of this Pseudomonas aeruginosa is very interesting because Pseudomonas is actually an oxalate consumer. And so if people don't know what oxalates are, these are typically they're plant toxins, and they're known first as oxalic acid, which then combine with minerals either in the environment or in your body, creating oxalate crystals, like calcium oxalate crystals. And these essentially crystallize into like a gem or a shard that's actually pretty sharp. And these sharp shards, they're like, sharp glass edges, and they can create symptoms and disease. And that includes diseases like pain syndromes like fibromyalgia, other neuralgias. So we're talking about the formation of calcium oxalate kidney stones, even. So
Can oxalates go anywhere in the body?
I wouldn't say they can go everywhere, and I'm not a
Okay.
master on it, but it's
Yeah.
very possible. It probably depends on if I don't know. Probably most places.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I
Um,
interrupt your thought. Go ahead.
no, that's okay. So these things are actually a lot of people are at a pretty good risk of this. In fact, that they're really common in a lot of foods that people eat, but it's really unfortunate because the people are pretty unsuspecting. In fact, a lot of them think that they're getting a healthy, let's say, a leafy green shake, but spinach is extremely high in oxalates. In fact, well, I won't get off too far, excuse me, too far into the weeds, but you want to make sure that yeah, this is getting off in the the way to counter that in the diet is to consume calcium with it. So this is why ancient peoples like I don't want to say ancient Italians because the ancient Italians didn't quite eat the same as they do today, like we like to attribute. But people who would eat spinach in the past would eat it with cheese, right? Dairy, because it's the calcium. It binds it up and then makes it largely unabsorbable. So, but even in an instance like this, something like Pseudomonas aeruginosa could eat it. Now, one of the main questions I'm going to ask if I see low secretory IgA, the slight growth of H. pylori, but not infectious, but they have symptoms. If they've got highly elevated Pseudomonas aeruginosa, what I'm going to ask is, do you eat a diet that's high in oxalates? Do you like your spinach smoothies? Do you consume beetroot tops and radish greens? I mean, these are the things that are very high in oxalates. And frequently, I actually hear not really. People don't really. They may, but usually the ones who do know already, at least in the experience that I've had so far, they're like, no, I know, and that's why my aeruginosa is really high. But the ones that have no idea about the aeruginosa, I explained to them the oxalates. They say, no, I don't like any of that. So then they don't eat it. So I said, well, I tell them, I said, you should check for mold, and I get one of two responses. So far, I'm batting about 950 out of 1,000. And the first response I get is, yeah, I know. I've already checked for mold. I just didn't mention it here in the post, but I'm aware of it. I do have some problems I'm trying to mitigate. Okay. So mold is present. Or the other one is, no, I didn't think that. I explained them this kind of connection here that I'm going to get to with you guys. It's the key point. Explain this to them, and they all of a sudden they're really convinced and say, "Oh, I should probably check because I do live with water damage. I do have some of these other symptoms, and I never really considered mold and blah blah blah." They look and they're positive. They're very positive. In many cases, they're like all but one or two people are like, "Yeah, no, it's not mold. I've checked," and I'm like, "Oh, okay." So it's not across the board a fit, but it seems to be a pretty good indication. And here's why. This is because a lot of people interface with one of the most common toxigenic molds in water damaged buildings. The two most common are going to be penicillin and aspergillus. And so these two molds release multiple different mycotoxins each, most of which, aside from being extremely toxic to every body system that we have, they're also that includes them being very immunotoxic. So they will suppress the immune system. In fact, there's pharmaceutical drugs made from mycotoxins that play a profound effect in absolutely suppressing the immune response. They're used for people who have organ transplants so that the body doesn't reject it. And then they're slowly weaned off as they recognize the immune system will accept the organ. But the pharmaceutical agent is derived from mycotoxins because they're that potent at suppressing immune function. And so basically, what you end up seeing is usually people who have these toxic mold exposures that have become chronic is they get immune suppression. That immune suppression leads to the decreased secretory IgA, which then allows to the colonization of aspergillus, which then allows to the production of oxalates, which then leads to the overfeeding of Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which then provides all the markers you see in that pattern on a GI map. And I'm not saying this is a fact. But again, I'm betting about 950 out of 1,000 across about 30 to 40 people I've checked with who have these markers. And they've all confirmed to me that either, yeah, it's a current problem or they weren't aware and they tested and it was. So I thought that was a pretty major finding. And I was curious. I wanted to share that here with you, Rich. And I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. 95% confidence level is insane. Are you including this in your book?
No, nope, not this.
Okay. Okay. Sure. Yeah. It doesn't, maybe it doesn't fit exactly, but no, that's absolutely fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. I have a sort of a unique skill in my former life. Before I was a pastor, I was a medical technologist, worked in hospital labs mostly. But in my microbiology rotation, um, it was hand plating the bacteria. And I will never forget, as long as I live, the smell of Pseudomonas aeruginosa, E. coli, and Proteus mirabilis.
Hmm.
I mean, they're literally locked in my memory. If you put that plate under my nose today, they have such unique smells, each of them. It's a
Wow.
worthless skill, but it's part of my history. So
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So what's the smell? I mean, like stool, but like a seriously foul stool?
no, not at all. Of course, keep in mind these are just pure
Oh,
bacteria colonies. So no. I mean, originally there was a tiny bit of stool, a tiny bit of urine, but the Pseudomonas is very fruity.
mm,
Of those three, it is by far it is pleasant, really, but so distinctive.
yeah.
So we would, as students, as mostly my experience when I was still a student, we would carefully smell it, and we're like, Pseudomonas. We would put the um, antibiotic little circles on it, stick it in for another day, and it has a pattern of some things it is sensitive to, and some things it's not. Sure enough, it's Pseudomonas. Yeah, but just
Wow.
just the smell is all you need. That's
That's
crazy.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. You may have used the word resilient in there, but you described resiliency or lack of resiliency almost the entire time you're talking here. But since this is the Resilient Biome podcast, and I love that word, so that's why I named the podcast that. What is your top recommendations that our listeners can do to have a more resilient biome?
Well, pretty simple, honestly. So, while I'm writing this book now, it really details your query here for about 300 pages, where it's just this deep dive into everything about digestion and disease. And so, like, I want to tell your listeners, if you want to be notified about when it comes out, you can go to my website. I think Rich will supply a link that you can
For
navigate to
sure.
get there. You can get on my newsletter, and you'll be notified there when it finally does come out. But basically, the whole idea of the book is an answer to your question, which is to just stimulate your natural digestive function. You know, um, all the way down too, which again stimulates the proper detox. It stimulates reduction of all the numerous digestive diseases when we stimulate it all the way to top to bottom. But beyond this, I like jerf. So just eat real food, eat the colored stuff, eat the funky ferments if you don't have mycotoxin issues, eat the naturally raised meats and fats, try to avoid the seed oils, avoid ingredients you can't pronounce, and shop the perimeter of the grocery store. These are really basic things you hear a lot of people say, but it doesn't mean they're not right. Don't be afraid to get dirty. That's a really big one. A lot of people are kind of worried about getting dirty. Go out there and shovel the cow pen a little bit. It's really good for you. But be smart enough to know when and how to clean yourself up. Like for 30 years there, I wasn't. And it'll start to predispose you to some things. So take care of yourself, but get dirty, take care of yourself. And always be sure to cleanse, detox, eat, sleep, and repeat, and just become aware and avoid the toxins in all shapes and sizes. That includes mycotoxins. And really, that's my best advice. Just be healthy and clean.
Nice. My first gut health book I read, I think it was two physicians or two PhD, I can't remember. And they had young kids, and their sort of rule of thumb was if you're playing outside, if you're playing with the dog, don't bother washing your hands. If you're out in the store in public or something, then definitely wash your hands. So definitely getting dirty, getting those good microbes,
Yeah.
which
Was
sort of
that
runs full circle to some
was
of our early questions.
was that Justin Sonnenberg, The Good Gut?
Yes, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I read that too. He and his wife are pretty brilliant. I love their work.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that citation. And I will
Yeah.
make sure, as you said, get all of the important stuff in the show notes so people can get a hold of you. Joe, thank you so much for your time. Very, very helpful. And I wish you the best in your own health so that you can continue to help others. So thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Rich. I appreciate you having me on, and take care, and maybe we'll do this again. Thank you.
Yeah, you as well.